Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board. Can I, in particular, welcome our Interim Chief Executive, Stephen Hughes, welcome, and our Interim Chief Financial Officer, Annabel Scholes, as well. Welcome to you both. In my brief, it's told I'm meant to give safety information, but I look around and think that everyone's been to enough meetings in this room and in this building to not need me to give that information out, so I will bypass that. The only other comment I would make is I know members have had problems in receiving information electronically about this meeting. That has been beyond the control of anybody in democratic services, and it appears to have been beyond the control of people in IT as well. I have made the point that we should, on all papers and notices, remind members that the papers can be accessed on the City Council internet site, going into Meeting Finder and finding the papers for a meeting. And we ought to make sure that all members are aware of that. So if there is ever a problem again with the electronic process, which I'm assured there won't be, there is another mechanism for doing that. But we do recognise there are a number of processes of conveying information that we've got to get working better. Please, if there is a problem, feed them in either to myself or to Alison so that we can be aware of them and try and do something about it. Because if we're not aware, then you're going to carry on having the problem. So I hope that everyone has now had electronic access, albeit too late, but has electronic access and has the papers in front of them. Okay. Right. Okay, so item 2, apologies for absence.
Yes, Chair. Apologies received from Councillor Negus with Councillor Hopkins as substitute, Councillor Pearce with Councillor Beach as substitute, and Councillor Morris with Councillor Galandris substituting.
Thank you. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. So the next item on the agenda is various minutes. I did ask if any members would advise in advance of any items they wish to raise, and I received no responses. I'm assuming everybody did receive that email, but that might be a presumption. So are members happy that I approve first of all, the minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of June? Yep. Are members happy to note the action sheet of the 15th of June? Yep. The minutes of the extraordinary meeting on the 24th of August, are members happy to approve those? Right, thank you. I have no additional chair's business, so we move on to item 5, and members should have had circulated Sid Ryan's questions oblique statement, and you should also have circulated my response. This is really going to be discussed later in the agenda, but I think that the response I'd give, Sid, is that I don't think there's anything you've raised that any member of this commission wouldn't agree with wholeheartedly. There are practical challenges, because it would be easy, for example, to say we'll voluntarily ask for all papers to be produced a week earlier. But actually, officers are facing deadlines in producing that information, and also we all want the papers to be as up-to-date as they can be before they're published. So there's a whole host of things there, but it is very timely, and the Audit Committee referral about public engagement, and I think the whole issue of how we involve members of the public in making our meetings relevant to them is a key issue. Not only are we looking at it on this agenda, but members have a meeting tomorrow where they're trying to set the work programme for scrutiny for the next year, and I hope your comments will be a timely reminder to members for that meeting. I'm afraid, in a true local government sense, I'm going to have to ask you to give us time to get this right, But I think we all welcome your watching brief and letting us know how you feel we're doing over time. Do you have anything you want to come back on?
Hello. No, not in particular. I agree. I know it's slightly unfair of me to come at you with demands for greater transparency when you've got so much else going on, but I really do think it is important. And if the council is going to kind of navigate its way through having to impose a lot of central government cuts, then I think it needs to be really open and honest with the people that it's serving, and also give them a voice through your systems. By making sure they can engage in the meetings. If I had any one suggestion, I would say that there's a real barrier to entry in that I had to submit this official statement to the committee, and I think people could do with a kind of lower bar for that, whether they could submit comments for you to consider that aren't officially on the record, or having to speak to a room like this would be useful. So yeah, the things that you can't say, like we're not very pleased about the cuts we have to make, you can let the public make those comments for you and get their points across. So that's all I'd say, and good luck with the programme.
No, thank you for your contribution. Thank you for keeping us on our toes, and I'm sure you're going to keep watching this, and I think it's really important that we keep this as a key item, not just to respond over the next few months, but to keep looking at seeing what we can do better to make it possible for people to engage. So, thank you. So, the next item on the agenda is item 7, which is the Bristol City Council International Strategy, and Caroline is going to introduce this one to us briefly. So, Caroline, over to you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Chair. So, there was a paper shared, and I'll refer to that, but you'll have seen it's an early draft. It's an outline. It's brought here today for early input to open the discussion, really, about the Council's international work and more broadly the City's international work. There's various reasons why it's brought for early input. We have Brexit, obviously, which I know lots of councillors are concerned about. Many councillors have got links with cities and countries around the world and want to input. Bristol's own population is going to become much more diverse over the next decade, so this is an issue that's in lots of different people's minds. So this draft will evolve, and there'll be consultation internally and with partners across Bristol, and it will come back to scrutiny when it's a more firmed up draft in the future. So I think some headlines for you. We're working to align this piece of work with the resilience strategy and the corporate plan. We're also talking to other partners across Bristol. So it's very much bringing together, coordinating the work that a lot of different organisations are doing with cities and countries around the world rather than just the council. That, we hope, is going to make the international engagement across the city more efficient and more effective. And it helps us to tell a story as a city when we're outside of Bristol and outside the UK. It's a first step in a longer-term ambition to have a joined-up city-wide international strategy. This is very much a first step. So I won't go into much more detail. I'd rather take this opportunity to hear from councillors, so I think I'll hand back to the Chair, but obviously detailed questions or more broadly, I'm more than happy to. I'd like to join the discussion.
Thank you, Caroline. Members have any questions on this draft report? Tom.
So thanks for bringing this. It's looking good. Just a couple of questions. So it says that there's going to be a shorter strategy made public and then a longer and more detailed one not put online. Why isn't that one going to be made public?
Yeah, they're not actually two strategies. The strategy will be the public document, and alongside that we're working on an implementation plan which goes into a lot of the detail about who from the council and also across Bristol would take up particular activities. So I guess it's not that it deliberately won't be shared, it's that it will be shared with partners across Bristol who are picking up some of the work.
could it be put online as well, just in the spirit of openness and transparency?
I think, I mean, that was one query actually, was how much to put online, because when you're actually naming cities and naming organisations and putting it online, you're also not naming other cities that you're potentially working with, and there's maybe a strange message out there. So that's one thing I'd welcome feedback on, either now or in the future. But yeah, I'd like to see as much of it as possible online. That's not the sort of working implementation.
Yeah, I understand why you don't want to name the cities, because it's a bit like competition.
Yeah, it's a bit strange, but there also is a benefit to naming them as well. So I'm not sure what's the best route.
Yeah,
right now.
I noted that it wasn't named in this report, for instance.
Yeah, because they're not selected, and we're still having that discussion.
Okay. And just on a slightly different subject, it talks about kind of building these existing links and then later on looking to build new ones. Just want to check when that would be. Would that be after 2021, after this kind of plan runs out?
I don't think there's a specific timeline. It's more that it's important at this point to build on the links that we've already got internationally, rather than saying, let's just create new links where we don't have those relationships. So that's what the focus of the strategy is at the moment. It's really leveraging the existing links. And every year the strategy, including where we're linking to as a priority, would be reviewed. And if one of those cities or countries it's just not the kind of relationship we're expecting, then I think we would rethink that. Evolving every year, and it's partly about capacity as well. So when we do feel that as a city we're working more closely together on international work, we can maybe be more ambitious about starting new relationships.
Great.
So no timeline.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Nicola?
I'd just like to say that sadly there's been a racist attack in my ward this week. And this looks at race, which is one of the protected characteristics. So I'd just like to know how this work is going to add to the legislation that already exists. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think my view is that if we have a focus on international communities within Bristol, as well as looking abroad, we're giving more value potentially than what those people feel already. And it's going to be less specific than it's a change in legislation or a change in policy. It's more that if some of those activities can be supportive of social cohesion, taking in consideration of race, then my sense is that would have more benefit. One of the outcomes talks about growing global citizens, and you can define that in various ways, but I think it's sowing the seeds within the wards and within all the different communities in Bristol, whatever the race, to just have a sense that they're a citizen of the world, not just of Bristol. So it sounds like a slightly woolly answer, but it's not so specific that we can say there'll be a change in policy. It's just that it'll help sow those seeds and hopefully create people that are really happy to have relationships with people from every race in Bristol and beyond. That's my sense.
There's a couple of points I wanted to make. The first one, and I'm loathed almost to mention Green Capital with Councillor Hopkins sat in the room, but I was lucky enough to see firsthand the profile that the Green Capital generated for the city on the international scene in terms of the visits and the leads that came out of it. And so I suppose one question is, are we happy that this strategy is going to enable us to maximise that build? Mm-hmm. The second is that I don't see a mention, I don't think, or I do see the International Twinning Association, but I don't see a great deal of mention of twinning. Mm-hmm. And I just happen to know from people who visited Bristol the warmth that which, for example, Oporto holds the link between Bristol, and I also know the strength of feeling between both Bristol and Tbilisi and Bristol and Georgia. Mm-hmm. And I hope that we are going to build on the connections that we already have that work well, albeit there may not be massive financial benefits, as well as those with the obvious Chinese connections where we would see massive trade, because actually it's the the linkages at all levels and different sorts of communities that mirror the city that we've got. And I couldn't quite pick that up from the way this was worded.
Okay, no, thank you. I think I'll answer that question first because it's more fresh in my mind. The implementation plan refers to the Bristol International Twinning Association beta in a lot more detail, and it sees it as a mechanism to help deliver a lot of the international work. So very much in line with what you're saying, it's got to be involved and aligned to the strategy. It would be crazy not to be. The beta coordinator sits within the international team where I also sit, so we're closely aligned and he's feeding into the strategy. I think without doubt we'll see a good number of the twin cities within the priority cities we're choosing. And the criteria that we're looking at priority cities through involves a multitude of links. So we want to link to cities where we have a twinning relationship, but we also have trade links, or we have an international community in Bristol, we have student recruitment. So one of the criteria will be that it's a multitude of links, and twinning is the first one we're looking at, to be honest. So I hear what you're saying, and if it doesn't come through more strongly in the strategy, that's really good feedback. I think it is in there in the implementation plan in a lot more detail. And then on Green Capital Partnership, one of the strategic outcomes is that Bristol builds an international reputation for certain things that we're very strong at. And one of those is the low carbon, the green agenda, the sustainability. And that's very much the profile that was built up during the Green Capital year. So we want to raise that, continue to raise that profile and to say this is something you should come and talk to Bristol about. It's still very much in our priority. So I think we'll see that reflected in the implementation plan and also in the strategic outcome that says we're going to do that.
Councillor Hopkins, as long as it's on the item on the agenda and not Green Capital.
And actually, in response to what was just said, I realise you're fairly new into position, but the reputation of this city was for quite a number of years as being very strong on sustainability. True. It just didn't suddenly appear. In fact, in some ways, it unfortunately didn't enhance our reputation, which had been there for quite some while.
Yes,
I have a concern about this, which in some ways is a little similar to Geoff's, I think, because it seems to be all things to all people. And rather than having a clear focus on what we do best and what we do really well, and if it is in serious danger of just being a lot of platitudes without any real positive outcomes.
If I can just add, and then I think we'll move on, but I think one of the reasons why I'm concerned is that I had the experience of sitting with a trade delegation in Tbilisi, meeting some of the biggest businesses in Georgia, and at the time we had no resources with which we could reciprocate the welcome that they were offering us. So, and it's very difficult for any member to say this at a time when we know the financial pressures the council is under, but if we're going to make international relationships work, we've got to be able to earmark an element of resource that's going to enable that process to succeed. And I know that's going to be a really delicate issue for senior officers and the Mayor in working out. But it is important that if we're going to have a policy, we've got to be able to make it work, and we've got to make sure we're getting returns for it, but that it's resourced enough to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. No, I very much agree. I think as an addition to that, we're hoping that the strategy, if it brings together a shared story for the city, then we're also enabling people outside of the council to say the same story about Bristol abroad. So if we can't be travelling, for example, as much as we'd like to be, other people in Bristol who are respected in their area can be doing that same story. But I also agree that there's an element of relationship building internationally which has to be done at a senior level, face to face. Yeah.
Gill.
Thank you very much. I just want... Wait till... Hi. I just wanted to ask about one of the strategic outcomes on page 31, number 2, about Bristol has a coordinated and citywide response to Brexit and a voice in negotiations. I just wondered if you can just sort of expand on that a little bit, because obviously, you know, these negotiations going to everything's changing very rapidly on that, you know, in that scenario, and I wonder how quickly we'll be in a position to really be proactive in those discussions on Brexit.
Okay, so immediately after the referendum, the Mayor set up a citywide group, which we called the Bristol Brexit Response Group, and the universities sit on there, VOSCOR, the Women's Commission, the Council, and Business West and IBB, so it's a cross-sector group. It had a few immediate priorities, which were to respond to city concerns around Brexit, so increase in racial tension and hate crime, and reassurance, and also try and understand a bit better the process the national government was going to set up, through which we can lobby as a city and separately as a council. So that work's been happening over the summer. With so much uncertainty from the UK government, it's very hard to know what we should be doing specifically, but there's some mapping work going on to try and understand better what's the economic funding sort of vulnerability that the council, the city and other organisations have. We're feeding into the Core Cities Group and the Local Government Association. The universities are feeding into Universities UK, but at the moment, to me, it feels like it's a sort of wait and see what the official channels are going to look like. And I don't think Bristol's alone in that. When we've been at Core City Group meetings, the other cities are feeling similar. So we're doing a little bit of increased understanding and sort of mapping, and we're also waiting to see what the formal channels are going to be. Mm-hmm. Could I pick up on a point from Councillor Hopkins that if it's too broad, and I hear what you're saying, I'd be interested to know what members thought we should be focusing in on more specifically. So I don't want to put a strategy out there that's all things to all people, and it just seems not specific enough. But I'd be interested to know in some of the things you'd like to focus on.
Well, basically, it's some of the things that we've already developed. I mean, you know, the twinning with where you've already got existing relationships, that's an example. It's easier to build on something that's already there rather than starting from scratch on a wider basis. You know, our reputation on sustainability and some of the technologies that we've developed locally, we're particularly strong on, and there are places around the world where that, you know, to put it mundanely, will make us a lot of money and will be very good for this city. So I think we need to look at what we're doing already and do it a lot better rather than just saying, aren't we wonderful?
Okay, thank you.
I'd like us to be a green capital of Europe.
Yeah, sorry. This is a wonderful setting, but it's very difficult to keep looking back. So apologies. Yes, please, Nicola.
Problem. I think my question is around the strategic outcomes, and just to agree with Gary, I think looking at them, and I appreciate the documents in draft at the moment, but with only 3 of the 4 strategic outcomes having KPIs against them, I think it's really difficult for us as members to understand how we're going to measure the success of those, because there is some overlap when you start to dig beneath the detail of what these outcomes are, and I think an annual review of 7 strategic outcomes over sort of 6 years, is it? I think it might be better to whittle those down to really, really firm strategic outcomes. Might be fewer of them, but then have some really, really great KPIs that we can look at, and maybe a more regular review, even if that's an audit review. You know, however that looks is, you know, interested in your view, but I just think I am slightly concerned that there is a bit of qualitativeness to some of this, and I think it's so important to quantify it now more than ever before.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. It's I've had a look at some of the other cities' kind of international strategies and what they put out, and I'm sort of reassured that they struggle in the same way. It's hard to be quantitative, but I take your point very much, and I think it's important.
Right. I think we can bring that to a close. Caroline, thank you for your contribution. And I think the really key thing that's come out of the debate we've had is that, in a sense, whatever policy we've come up with, it's got to evolve according to what's needed to the best interests of the city at the time. So That's another cut got to go in the budget now. But thank you for your time. Thank you. So we move on to item 8, delivering the corporate plan, Outturn performance, and welcome Mark Wakefield. Mark, can we ask you to just introduce this, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm Mark Wakefield, so I'm the Service Manager for Performance, Information and Intelligence. And I'm here to do 2 items today. The first is to talk about the last year's performance framework and the outcomes, and the other is to talk about what we might do next year. So if I take the first item first, and under broad headings you can see, I've got to put that on top of that other one. You can see that we have in section 6 48 measures that were designed to look at performance at a strategic outcome level against the corporate plan in existence for the previous administration. And you can see that, broadly speaking, 44% of them were above target, 39% ended up below target, and another 5% on top of that were of particular concern and quite significantly below target. Now, there's another sort of broad heading that you could look at, which is the proportion of those indicators that had improved compared to a year before. So regardless of target setting, have we improved or got worse in some of those areas? And you can see 61% have improved, and the rest either stayed the same or got slightly worse. So on both of those sort of summary levels, you'd say against the corporate plan, it's sort of mixed and an even scorecard, if you like, if not slightly in favour of improvement, depending on which indicators you were most interested in, of course. So, as the report states, there are a number of highlights. I won't read them all out, but there were some things that have moved the most, or things that we've been most active on as an authority, and those are set out there. Again, a mixture of things that have got better and some that have got worse. And at the end, you see an additional couple of items where we've specifically talked about those things that are still of concern against the corporate plan last year, which are affordable housing and people in NEETs, basically people who are NEET, not being in education and training, etc. So those 2 items obviously have been well publicised in the last year. It's been to OSM, and you've got a number of projects underway that are focusing on those things. So, just to finish up on that item, this is the last time that the report in this format will come to OSM, and we'll be working next year to come up with something that meets the new corporate plan. But just to reassure everybody, of course, that the business as usual process is that the individual scrutinies will receive reports as they do at the moment until we design that new process. But this is the year-end position, and I'd invite comments from the members.
Brenda?
I will make it stay on. Thank you, Chair. I've got a few comments on the report. Page 40, it says public health outcomes have worsened. Do we have any idea why those are? It might be unfair to ask you, but it's just a query on that one.
Well, you did receive a presentation from the Director of Public Health earlier on in the year, and she went into a great amount of detail about the things that they were doing. Essentially, the biggest headline measure was that the inequality between the richest areas and the poorest areas had deteriorated. I think that was the key sort of marker for it. But broadly speaking, a lot of the interventions around things like smoking well, actually, if we look in Appendix A in the report, I'm not sure what the page number is, but you can see that across the board, smoking, there's more people that smoke. There's been more accidents, I think. Hold on.
I think it's probably page 49.
Page 49. I've got a different set of papers. I'm sorry about that. So childhood obesity as well as worsened. So I'd have to refer you to the information given by the director when she came to you. Sorry, it's not my area of expertise.
Well, there is one about a query about the data itself on page 48, which is actually coming up as page 5 on Appendix A.
Okay.
And that's about why is the data only up to Q2 2015-16? That's BCP 001, alcohol-related hospital admissions.
Yeah, this is one that we get from the health service. So we're kind of, not all of these are quarterly numbers. Some of them are annual numbers. But what happens is there's a lag period in some of them, and I think this is probably one where there's a lag period.
And just a couple more, Chair. On page 51, BCP 005A and 5B, that's good news on that one, because I know the team have done a lot to increase the uptake of direct payments. So I think it's only fair to say that's really positive. And the final one is on page 57, BCP 183, about overall satisfaction with the council. And I wondered if there was any link in that one with the problems people have got of actually contacting the council, because I'm certainly receiving a number of complaints about being absolutely unable to get through on the phone lines, and the phones dropping out after sitting there for quite a period of time. And they come to councillors in desperation because they can't make contact themselves. So I wondered if that satisfaction level could be directly linked to some of that.
You'll be aware that the details of that number are in the quality of life survey. It doesn't specifically ask about why are you satisfied or not satisfied, but you could draw an inference from some of the other headings in the rest of the survey. But it is a simple question of whether you're satisfied with the council.
Just on that point, Brenda, we just might remind members that we are, of course, meeting tomorrow to discuss our work programme, and if others shared your views, they might well wish that issue to be receiving suitable attention, because it might reduce all our mailbags and inboxes significantly. But that's obviously an issue for others to consider tomorrow. John and then Gary.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick key on keeping Bristol moving. BCP 064, we welcome 12. It's BCP 064. The increase in number of passenger journeys on buses, that's good news, it's above target, fantastic. But the other thing that matters to people very much is the punctuality and reliability of the buses. Now, we don't seem to have the data. I appreciate we've had a few problems with utility works, Metrobus works, but those are now coming to an end. Will we be able soon to actually monitor the punctuality and reliability of the buses?
There are a whole set of performance indicators below this level that is not brought to OSM, for example, but that goes to place scrutiny and to place leadership team, and that may well be one of them. I certainly know that overall satisfaction with the bus service is a question that's regularly asked of the public, and they would obviously take punctuality as one of their own key measures.
Gary?
Great minds obviously think alike. I'd like to endorse what Brenda said with regard to that. We all now get far more calls than we used to because people just can't get through. And it really is not productive. But in actual fact, the other point I was going to make was exactly on what John's brought up there about punctuality. And the way that it's measured is utterly ridiculous, and we do need to take a firm grip on this, because if the bus doesn't turn up at all, it's not marked down as late. Which, you know, is just absolutely appalling. And having been involved with bus campaigns recently, public feeling on this is absolutely, you know, they're apoplectic with the main operator. And really, the part of the problem is that our team, transport team, do not have data. They've got no idea how many people are on the buses, how well used they are. So when an operator says they're losing money on it, they just have to believe them. And unless we've actually got proper measurement and proper data, we can't even address, which is a huge issue for Bristol.
Olly?
Thank you, Chair. As someone who had the pleasure of using a bus to get to the meeting today, as is so often the case, it's not just the punctuality of buses, it's the frequency that makes a huge difference. When you have frequent buses near where you live, you're more likely to use them. When you have a bus that goes every hour and it might be 3 minutes ahead of schedule, in which case you might have an hour and 3 minutes to wait for the next one, you're unlikely to bother wasting time waiting for buses. So that is part of it. There are also punctuality issues, but they're mainly stuff that, from my experience, is not necessarily, and I'm going to surprise myself here by defending first, but it's not necessarily their fault. I mean, just first as an example, because they're the one I get the week ticket on. I mean, it's things like the number of roadworks in the city. Some of them are a surprise at times when you're going to a meeting and suddenly a new set of roadworks have popped up somewhere as a pleasant little addition to your day. But also stuff like the appalling, and I've flagged it up with transport officers and nothing has been done, the appalling problems of illegal parking. I mean, a good example was the A38 just today, saying if you have stuff parked on single yellow or double yellow lines blocking traffic passing through, then nothing can get through, and that definitely includes buses. And if you have cars parked or vans parked in bus lanes at the hours when they're in operation, then the buses have to keep going back into the main traffic and then back through. So there are all these sorts of things that add on to it and that don't seem to get addressed. So I have to say I have every sympathy for some of the drivers, but the frequency thing is always the one that turns up with people, including in parts of my ward where they would like better bus services. I mean, just on the edge of your ward, in fact, Chair, the 77 service is not well liked, although it would be loved if it was frequent. So it's that's sort of those little differences that make something that are quite important there. And I would say actually that part of the increase in bus use is probably also due to the good fare ideas, like the week ticket, £17 for a week, and you can go any place you want within Bristol whenever a bus turns up. I was going to say whenever you feel like it, but in some areas that might be more difficult. I did think that I was a bit worried about the new homes target. Building 1,000 new homes by 2029, and we have completed 8. I thought, wow, that's good going. I'm not sure. But I do have every confidence, though, in my new colleague, Councillor Smith's ability to improve this figure. I've been contacted only today, in fact, about the household waste reuse, recycling and composting. There are rumours circulating apparently on Facebook, that bastion of truthfulness, that everything or almost everything that goes to recycling gets landfilled, which is not the case, but there is a need for better communication about that from the council, although anything that the council does communicate will probably be assumed to be a lie. So it's a lose-lose situation there, but I was pleased to see that we're heading towards the 50% target, and I know that from some of the discussions that have taken place at other times, and I think are more appropriate for those other times, there are suggestions councillors across this political spectrum have come up with that would actually improve the percentage of recycling. Cycling itself across Bristol, there is a need for better maintenance of some of the cycle routes, and particularly cycle lanes on the main roads. I know on the A38 there have been problems identified over a period of time in places of little potholes and things turning up, and it might help if more was done on that. Otherwise, my last comment, just to say that I was actually pleased with BCP 151, which was the increase in tourism to Bristol. I think that's a really positive thing. It'll bring a bit more money into the local economy, and yeah, it was nice to see a nice good news item tucked away in there, but it was kind of dwarfed by concerns about some of the big items that seemed to be quite adrift. But I thought I'd end on a positive.
Charlie.
Thanks, Chair. I had a question about BCP 124, reduce the total CO2 emissions in Bristol City. I can't quite work out if emissions are going up or if they're not going down as quickly as we think they are, and if so, is it a one-off or a trend?
So the down arrow means that it's not as good as it was a year ago. And because it's amber, it also means that it's not met the target that we had set ourselves at the beginning of the year. Now, I don't know any more than the comment that as the officers have put in that are responsible for that particular area. So it's one where we would expect, if it was appropriate, for the Directorate Scrutiny to ask that question of the service itself. So I can't give you any more than what's written in there. If appropriate, yeah.
Nicola?
I'm just asking if we can have some data presented in a more helpful way. For example, if you look at page 40, where it talks about percentage of adults with learning difficulties known to social care, it talks about performance is currently at 77.5%, the highest since 2012. Well, we know that when the Conservative government came into power, they started cutting public services since 2010. So some more comparative information might be helpful.
Okay, so again, that's something that can be supplied in a forum for more detail. It's not something we do. It's normal for OSM, but it's available data.
Okay. And also, it says that public health outcomes have worsened. I'm just wondering where the information is about the measures that have been put in place to correct that.
Well, my first reaction is to refer to the minutes of OSM that the Director of Public Health attended, because she went through a very long list of measures and projects that were actually underway in the department. I don't remember everything that she said, but that information is on the record.
Gill.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. My question, I suppose, is quite general, but what I really would like to know is how this data is going to inform us when we are likely to have job losses, and how we ensure, or is there a mechanism for ensuring that in the areas that we don't perform so well, we are not going to lose a lot of staff in those areas, and there's some kind of mechanism for, making sure that we've still got the resources to address the areas where we're not doing well. Does that question make sense, really? So it's a kind of mechanism as to how this feeds into decisions that potentially could be made on job cuts and that sort of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of issue that would come up in the next item, which is essentially that obviously we are going to design a new performance framework based on new priorities of the new administration, but also in the light of linking outcome to activity and to finance, etc., so that we can do exactly that and make decisions on resources and performance and outcome. So
I am wondering whether with that question you didn't almost seamlessly move on to the next item. And I think probably it makes sense to move on to that, because I think the important thing to me in terms of how we use performance management is that we are producing a corporate plan based on, as I understand it, based on the Mayor's manifesto. And the logic is that OSM should be looking at corporate performance objectives, and we should be ensuring that Scrutiny, the individual commissions, are looking at key service objectives that fit in with the key parameters of the corporate plan. And what has happened in the past is that we've often had targets and performance indicators that seem like a good idea, but weren't necessarily the top performance objectives of either the senior leadership team or the cabinet. So I think that it therefore makes sense to move on to talking about the performance reporting framework moving forward, unless any member has a really burning issue they still want to raise under item 8. I'm going to move on to item 9. So, Mark, would you like to lead us into that section?
I think I set out the issue and what the work is underway, basically in the front page of the report, and so it's to recognise, of course, that the ambitions and priorities of the new administration are not going to coincide with the old administration, and certainly in terms of the themes and the flavour and the nuances around it. So how do we then respond to what will be the new determined priorities and some of the actions that we're determined to take in those different areas? How do I satisfy the different layers of the organisation and the different governance arrangements that they are able to take good decisions and they're able to scrutinise those decisions and everybody's able to be confident about the decisions that they're making? And it's kind of a question for all layers of the organisation and all the committees that are interested in performance, and of course that no doubt will be all committees and all officers and layers of management. How do you want to influence that process, and how have you got any comments immediately on things that you would like to happen as I work with stakeholders, as I work in parallel with those officers that are developing the corporate plan, and as I contribute to that plan also? A bit like the question that we just had from Councillor Kirk. Well, there are things that might be looked at differently if you had them associated with the cost of them, and it's not just a relentless upward drive in performance that we're looking for. Maybe you would be looking for an appropriate balance between cost and performance. It's those types of questions that I want to get at with the various committees and indeed the new lead members of the Cabinet.
I don't know why I thought you were going to attract my attention, Gary, but we'll let you go first.
Clearly, the plan, when it emerges, won't just be the manifesto, will it? Because it'll be the practical elements of the manifesto that might be delivered within the financial framework that's available to do the job. So, it won't be what was in the leaflets necessarily. It never actually is. But when we see that, clearly a lot of our work has got to be looking to see whether those stated objectives are actually delivered. But what I would put in a plea for is that OSM has a responsibility to look not just at what the administration wishes to be judged upon, but what the population of Bristol feel is important. So I think that we should also keep the option open of looking at one or two areas which are not regarded necessarily by the administration as what they're going to deliver on.
And I think, and I'm just looking at two members of the Cabinet sat in front of me, but actually I don't think that, I'm guessing Cabinet wouldn't have a problem with that, because if there is an issue that is sufficient importance, I'm sure that scrutiny would put the case for it to become a key priority, and I believe that there would be that would be well received by the executive as well. So I think, but you're absolutely right. We have to be looking at things that we think may have been omitted from those priorities and draw them to attention. So, Mark, that's another little interesting challenge for you to bear in mind in terms of the information that we're looking for.
Well, I think it also goes to the development of the corporate plan as well, doesn't it?
We hope so, but not necessarily.
Right. Does anybody else? Can I just make the point as well that I believe one of the problems that the council has had over many years is that it set itself too many key performance targets and has spent a lot of time trying to solve some and then moved on to trying to solve others and actually almost cannot see what it's trying to achieve because there are so many in process. And so I think I see it an important role for scrutiny and the executive combined to identify enough indicators to give the information that is required, but not so many that we lose sight of where we're heading. I think Mark's comment about needing to identify the financial parameters are even more pressing now than they ever were, because we may have to look at some of the targets that are set and actually question whether we can afford to deliver that target when others may be falling much further behind. And I think, therefore, a mechanism, probably that's much more for executive to be making those decisions than scrutiny, but I think one needs to be able to see the route by which those decisions are taken. I suspect that we may well have discussions relating to performance indicators that come out of our programme setting tomorrow, because some of the work programme that scrutiny sets will help to highlight some of the issues that backbench members think are significant, and therefore that might help to identify targets and performance indicators that you will need to see if they can be accommodated in the information that's provided in the future.
Well, if it's helpful, I can come along to that session as well.
Great. Thank you. I plan to close this item as I don't see anyone else desperate to speak. Mark, thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
So we move on to item 9, performance reporting framework. Oh, sorry, item 10, quarter 1 finance report. I haven't moved up. Serves me right for using paper. I do apologise. Quarter 1 finance report. Stephen, are you going to introduce this?
Well, I'll say it I'll say something very. The report's there. Hopefully you've read it. We're here to answer questions. That's myself and Annabelle, who's the Section 151 officer. But I don't think I need to go through it in detail.
Annabelle, do you have anything?
No, the report is laid out in front of you.
Right.
It gives you the overall review of the financial position of both revenue and capital. The only thing I want to say to scrutiny is that the financial monitoring is on an improvement journey. And I think we've come a long way with this quarter 1 monitor in actually developing the information we're sharing and we will continue that journey. So we will be transforming this report as we move forward throughout the year to ensure that we are actually providing the information we require. We have been doing some work with Mark around linking performance as well through to our financial monitoring, and that will be a development that will come forward in the future as well. So, but the report is laid out in front of you.
Right, and if I might also add that Craig is here as well, is the executive member for finance, but to also make the point that we have got a comprehensive report here, and there is no pretence, I think it's fair to say, Stephen, to be giving us the answers. What it is doing is setting out the position, and there is no point in repeatedly asking for answers when this is an open report that is actually showing where we are. So I hope that members will address any comments they have to make in that light. So, John.
Thanks very much, Chair. It's really about financial controls. You mentioned we're on a journey and we're getting better financial controls. But I work with lots of businesses and they produce weekly figures, certainly monthly figures, and what they track is their budget, their actual performance. For a lot of people, it seems that this is a surprise. We've suddenly discovered we've got a black hole. Now, are you saying that an organisation the size of Bristol City Council did not have at least a monthly tracking system, so that if the actual expenditure was in excess of the budget, it should have flashed red lights immediately, and people should have said, we've got a problem? And it seems lots of departments seem to have had problems, because when you look at it, it's all over the place. We've got little black holes, and suddenly you've got a massive deficit. Why wasn't it flashed up earlier?
I think it's important to be put in the context my comment of an improvement in reporting. So internally, there have been monthly reporting through to management teams. And basically what we're doing here with the Q1 monitor is about improving the reporting we're doing externally about the financial position. I cannot make comment, I'm afraid, about the previous reporting. The governance arrangements were in place. How the effectiveness of that has been throughout last year is something that we're going to do a review on, and it was actually discussed at Cabinet. So that is a review that's going to be done, but I can assure you there was a structure in place. Actually, as you talk about weekly management information, all of our budget holders can log on online and receive their financial position at any point in time. So it's a real-time available reporting for our budget holders internally.
So I mean, why didn't the red lights flash? Because what happens in business usually, if you actually spend more than you've got in your budget, you go outside your overdraft limit and the bank bounces your cheques. Obviously, it doesn't work like that with the council. We know all about that. But it doesn't work quite like that. But somebody must have known, and it just doesn't seem to have been brought to people's attention. And I appreciate that we're looking at the past, but I think we need to know what's happened. Somebody must have known, and why didn't they alert members?
So I kind of reiterate what Annabelle's just said, and in particular the point about the review that we're intending to undertake to have a proper understanding of what did happen. I think it is the case that there was awareness that the process, the two sort of key drivers here. One is about service pressures being greater than forecast, and the other is about underperformance in terms of the change programme. And the point about these things is the extent to which they're off track is really only as good as the profile that you put in place in the first place. And for something like a change programme, that's a really difficult thing to estimate. So there was awareness that there were risks which need to be managed, and there was internal effort about bringing them back on track. But they hadn't been, as my understanding, obviously I wasn't here, the same degree of openness in terms of the reporting through to both Cabinet and Scrutiny that we're intending to put in place now. So I would hope that from now on you would get a much clearer picture of where we are on a regular basis, but you will still need to understand that these are not accurate to the last degree. This is a forecast of where we might be if we didn't take any further action. It's not completely scientific because we don't really understand. We never could understand, what is going to be, how many people are going to present themselves as homeless next week, how many people are going to need care packages. That's a variable factor. This is still will always remain a forecast, an estimate, not until the year is ended.
Gary?
Before me. I asked the question of the Cabinet on Tuesday, and I've got to compliment, at least I got a written answer within a sensible period of time, which is significant improvement on the previous administration's efforts. I have to say, though, that the answer worried me almost as much as when I put the question, because a £9 million shortfall, if you could put it that way, is identified under Place Directorate, which is rather a lot of money. And I was asking, where exactly has this occurred? Because there was a general comment about, there's a discrepancy of 9 million, which we haven't got what we thought we would have. And the answers, where I was asking for which properties, when is this going to be rectified, when can we actually see the savings coming through, were quite worrying. And they said that, effectively, if I paraphrase slightly, that the estimates initially seem to be broad estimates and not based upon detailed analysis of individual properties. It doesn't desperately surprise me, but is concerning. But then it goes on to say, in the second answer, that you're not able really to tell me too much because you haven't got the detail of where the shortfalls are and how it's made up. So if you don't know the elements, how do you know it's £9 million?
The reality is there were assumptions made at the outset of the previous 3-year medium-term financial plan.
Yeah.
So there was an element of money identified that would come through from particular savings.
Yeah, finger in the air, 10% or whatever. Yeah.
That is how we know what hasn't been achieved,
yes.
Because it's about how that figure was held within the financial system and how that was then actually shared within the service. So we can know that that is the figure that hasn't been delivered.
So that suggests then that although there was an overall saving figure given against property, there was nothing to back it up, because nothing was identified against individual projects and individual properties. Is that correct?
There were some form of assumptions that we're taking at a point in time. I think the point we were trying to share and be open about is the detail of which those assumptions were taken, and it was not done at individual property level.
Gill.
Thank you. This is quite a general question, and forgive me if I'm asking something that's very obvious, but I'm quite new to OSM and I don't really have a background in finance. So the question I have actually is, because the council and many councils now have been forced to outsource so many functions and services to private companies, what I'd like to know is, do we have enough key personnel with the skills to monitor those contracts to ensure we get an absolute best value for money? Now, I don't know a lot about this, but on the ground in my ward, this is the sort of thing I'm noticing, where contracts are given out, but we don't always know whether we're getting best value from those contracts because we don't know who is following them up. So it's quite a general question, and I just wonder if you can shed any light on that, because it seems to have some bearing on finances, because we give a lot out of council now.
Seems like a pretty good question for a starter, I have to say.
Actually, I don't think Bristol has outsourced as much as many councils. in many ways, but it still has a number of significant contracts. And I think one of the things that we will want to review is the extent to which we've got robust contract management in place. And it's clearly variable. It's better in some areas than others, but it's certainly an area which needs to be examined, and there's probably room for improvement. But I couldn't tell you exactly, what the scope is in what position is in different places, but it's something that's important.
Okay, it is just something I've observed, and I'm wondering where it might fit into the scrutiny work planning tomorrow. Kind of, I guess it's sort of business change or but if that's the sort of thing we want to look into, I just wonder where it best sits.
Well, it's interesting you saying that, because certainly one of the suggestions I put on for consideration was contracts and the monitoring of the quality. It's partly stemming from the slight challenge I had with local residents having their cars covered in an inch of dust from road surfacing, which from all the stories that were coming back from residents, it was very questionable whether that contract was being managed and administered as effectively. So I mean, I think that could be ranged over 100 different issues. So I think, again, that's very much an issue that it's a question of whether individual members can convince enough other members that that is something that needs to be examined. And it's perhaps pertinent, because a comment I should have made at the start was that until now, the budget process has been reviewed by the Business Change Scrutiny Commission, and the decision that's been taken is that because a significant amount of the challenges that the authority has arrive from business change, that business change, rather than scrutinising everybody else's budgets, needs to be scrutinising the business change budget, and that overview and scrutiny management would review the overall corporate budget, and then individual commissions would look at the service. So that's why we're in this position. But actually, the whole issue of contracts is something that ought to be a key part of the business change process, because getting value for money out of what we do is going to be even more critical now than it was. So I hope you will get the chance to make that point in the course of tomorrow. Olly, and then two Nicolas, and Charlie as well. So Olly, if we can start with you.
Thank you, Chair. As someone who had the pleasure of spending the first 2 years as a councillor on both business change and audit, I have been through 2 budget processes and found it an exceptionally frustrating experience. And I know that I'm not alone. I think there were 70 of us who found it frustrating as councillors each year. But in terms of I also had the advantage of covering on a number of other scrutiny commissions, because I've been quite flexible about being able to help other colleagues. And it did strike me that at no point on any of the scrutiny commissions I covered on did they discuss finance. So finance was never part of a particular scrutiny commission. And I really have felt, particularly on something like people, where there was not just a massive overspend, but where the knowledge that the committee members have and will build up over a period of time is much better than mine. I don't know enough about people stuff. Whenever I've had a query about people, I've asked people like Gill, who've sat on people. Sorry, that sounded wrong then. Has sat on People's Scrutiny Commission. Asked questions for clarification about things, especially when helping to prepare Labour's response to the budgets proposed by the previous mayor. I would like to see more finance being discussed at those scrutiny commissions, because I just really think that it being all dumped on one committee was not necessarily a brilliant idea, and an ongoing review then could take place, especially now, to make sure that the scrutiny was taking place of the budgets in those directorates. I was also at the meeting, the legendary, I suppose, meeting last December where business change were doing our drilling into the finances of particular directorates, and the two directorates we had that day were people and business change, which, as it turns out, was almost the whole of the overspend for last year. And there was a bit of discontent in advance in that we were not happy at being sent some brightly coloured pie charts of blessed memory, and that really was what we were sent. It was not helpful, and 3 of us asked for the meeting to be adjourned so that the officers could actually produce a proper report and then come back. But it was 4 votes to 3, and the meeting carried on, and there was precious little information in the actual presentations either, and the Director of People had to come back in January to present a report again. I felt angry for a lot of my colleagues because they have to book time out of their day jobs to go to those kinds of meetings, and there was nothing to read in advance, and there was nothing to discuss any sense because there was almost no information. And I got to hear answers, I could call them answers, to questions from people like Steve Clark from the Green Party, who was really frustrated, that would have not been out of place on Yes Minister. So there was an element of hiding of information that was important, and it did eventually emerge in January that there was a big overspend already in that directorate, in the People Directorate, although for some reason the then person in charge of business change got away scot-free. I suspect because he spoke after the guy from People had spoken, and having seen the councillors tear the People person across, invented something that sounded plausible enough to keep us off his back. But that kind of frustrating experience, I think, can't happen again. And I would say that as Chair of Audit, if anyone has that kind of problem again, send them to Audit, and we will be like the Spanish Inquisition on them, and make sure that information is shared where it needs to be. It's not unreasonable to expect councillors who are held by the people of Bristol as responsible for the finances to actually be able to access the information we need to make reasonable interventions about the budget. On a brief note, there was an increased capital costs of major projects. Noticeably, Metro Bus was tucked away in here somewhere in the papers. And I have been keeping Metro Bus on the agenda at Audit, because although they're not concerned about the governance, there are concerns about likely overspends, and now increasingly concerns about whether it will even have an operator, which I would have thought was a fairly basic thing, but based on the planning committee meeting I attended where I opposed it, I have to say that I'm not surprised that so much has gone wrong since, or seems to have done. I may be proved wrong in the long term. I hope that I am for the good of the people of Bristol, but I haven't been impressed. And there are little things tucked away in this paper, like there is a £0.6 million pressure caused by costs of 100 Temple Street, for which there is no budget set aside. And all sorts of unbudgeted rental payments required for the underfall yard. Unbudgeted this, unbudgeted that. It seems to have been a bit of a disaster to have all this spending going on and no budget for it, because I can't imagine in many areas of life that being allowed to continue. I would say also it hasn't been helpful that we've had so many interim people running important things like finance. That's not a criticism of the people who've been interim, but when someone's there permanently and full-time, they do very much make their mark on a department, and they can turn it around. And it would just be nice to have that sort of long-term stability there. I was also concerned by page 82 that 50% increase, so 52% increase in pupil exclusions, costing £1 million for accommodating those children. Do we know what's causing this to happen? I mean, obviously, there is some misbehaviour going on to get excluded, but has there been this massive spike? Is it in particular parts of the city? I mean, it just strikes me that if there's a cause of that, it might be nice if the officers could get looking at addressing that rather than having to do the aftermath mop-up, because that will also impact on our ability to hit the targets we're still not hitting on our 5 A to C GCSEs, with English and Maths included. And last but not least, on planning, because I sit on planning, and I know that they tend to be a bit. They have just enough staff to do what they need to do, but oftentimes they can be a bit stretched. Although they have a £0.2 million surplus this year, it would be nice if they could be, when I say left alone, not in my notes, but just not targeted with another cut, because actually the impact of that is that some of the big projects that may overspend go through planning, and Metrobus and the Arena and all sorts of other things being mentioned a lot by the public. It would be good to make sure that good planning takes place so that the concerns are ironed out before they end up costing the taxpayer more in the long term to sort out.
Thank you, Olly. You've probably given about a month's work for for several committees and several officers, I should think, in answering those questions. But I think your comments about unbudgeted expenditure is something Craig and I have been discussing that, and I'm sure it's a matter of great concern to everyone, and clearly both finding the answers as to why and, more importantly, making sure it's not ongoing are the most critical issues. I would suspect the Audit Committee would rightly be wanting to raise some questions in that respect, and indeed should be doing so.
Well,
yeah.
We are very much looking forward to the 23rd of September when we get to go through the annual audit of last year's accounts. So everyone is welcome to come along and join in the fun.
I always look forward to that meeting, but you'll have to accept my apologies on this occasion. Nicola.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I've been aware since May this year that there's been an awful lot of information and statistics around housing need in Bristol and housing stock. So I'm wondering why it's difficult to set a budget for the needs of homeless people in the city, when actually when you look at this report on page 75, you will see that the report proposes that closing the M shed on a Monday and making the museum staff more friendly will save the city £0.2 million a year. So I'm wondering how we can measure some things but not others.
I mean, there is a difference in quality between those two. The reason why we know how much we can save by changing the hours of the museum is the costs are relatively straightforward to measure. They are the staff time that's been used and the costs of running the building. The problem with homelessness is that it's a demand-led service. We don't know how many homeless people we're going to meet, and in particular we don't know the nature of the supply that we're going to have available at any point in time, which makes a big difference to the costs of meeting the needs of homeless. So the homelessness budget is always going to be a very difficult one to set, whereas for a service where essentially what the cost of the service is the opening of the building, the staff that come in it, and not the demand that's been placed upon it, is much easier to measure. That's the reason for why you can measure one but you can't measure the other. Of course you can, and that's part of what they do. That's how the forecast is created in the first place, by looking at what has happened in the past, what's likely to happen in the future, and equally what mitigating actions have been or are planned to be put in place to deal with those issues. I'm just saying it's inherently more difficult to get that precisely right compared with the costs of a service which is determined by the number of staff that you employ.
Some of the museums, there are,
That's true, but the revenue contribution is relatively small. It's a much more stable indicator than the number of homeless people. The point about homelessness, as I was trying to it's not just the numbers, it's the fact that if you've got social housing available, you can put them in people who are homeless directly into social homes. the cost is very small. If, on the other hand, you haven't and you have to place people in temporary accommodation, the costs are much higher, both in terms of the direct costs that you incur and in terms of the subsidy that you lose. And then if you've run out of temporary accommodation, you have to place people in bed and breakfast, the costs are much higher still. And managing that on a daily basis is a problem because you don't know one day to another how many people are going to present themselves as homeless, what supply you've got available. They're very much more volatile costs.
All right, so I'll take Nicola Beach next, and then Charlie, and then Jude.
Yeah, thanks. As a sub today, I put myself forward really for this basic observation from me. Obviously, reading this report, there's an enormous amount of work to do, how we're going to balance the books, and as a new councillor, this makes for pretty difficult reading, to be honest. But my point is linked to Gill's around commission services, particularly demand-led ones and people. How do we control those costs, get value for money? But I think we have to be passionate about the fact that we've got to improve and maintain our social value and actually provide for the residents of Bristol. Steve, if we can find a way of making a step change to incentivise social value as part of contract management, actually monetise and incentivise social value, because in particular where we're dealing with private sector organisations and we're commissioning services out in that direction, how we can meet this kind of overspend and get control of these budgets and not impact on service delivery through commission services amazes me, and that's what I'll be keeping a really close eye on. And secondly, for me, on museums, I think if you the cost to hire the M shed in particular is so ridiculously expensive, you've immediately excluded a big chunk of the city. So I think if you drop your prices, you probably find that your revenue might increase. I think it's just an observation from me.
Charlie.
Yes, so, I mean, there is a bit of a narrative going on here, isn't there? There's the whole, it's far worse than we thought, isn't it all George's fault thing? And I'm not entirely sure I buy it all. I've got here in front of me a press release put out by Tony Dye, who was our mayoral candidate, which was published on the 10th of May, warning of £80 million worth of cuts, so sort of 20 million over and above the stuff we knew about before. And, well, he didn't win, and he didn't have access to all the sort of the council resources. So if he was predicting that then, I think it was kind of out there. I think we kind of knew about it. I mean, in a sense, it doesn't really matter, because somebody's going to have to make the cuts, and they're going to be awful anyway. But I think there's an alternative narrative there. But I suppose my question is, I mean, it's about all of the... It's the job losses, really. It's the hundreds of jobs which are going to go, and it's particularly the ones which are going to go quickly. I mean, that sounds to me like it's going to cause chaos. And can you convince me that there's a way of managing your way through that with suddenly large numbers of people not being there? How will service be able to carry on as normal? Or there's surely going to be a significant degradation in service then? And is there an alternative not to take a more measured and longer-term approach to actually work out a plan how to do it and do it over a longer time period? Because it seems to me that I'm not sure the plan's there, it's just sort of the emergency measure.
So two points really to make in response to that. First of all, to emphasise, as it says in the report, the seriousness of the situation that we find ourselves in. The cuts that you referred to that were projected ahead are the ones that come as a result of the further reduction in revenue support and other grants that we are still anticipating. The overspend that we're talking about here has occurred even though in February we set a budget which knew about what was going to happen on funding and set a budget which was intended to balance in year. To have an in-year forecast deficit of almost 30 million on a net budget of, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but it's 317 million is a very serious situation indeed. We generally don't have the time to do a long-term plan and turn things around. We have to act now. Now, I understand exactly your concern. I have similar concerns about people randomly leaving the organisation on scale in a short period of time. But the process that we're going through is one of assessing what applications are coming for voluntary severance and taking a risk assessment of that, including having a mindful eye on ensuring that we've got business continuity, but also taking advantage of the opportunity to move people around the organisation, creating, in some cases, opportunities which wouldn't previously have existed. So this isn't... we wouldn't have wanted to do it this way. I would much rather have had a longer plan to be able to redesign everything over a period of time, put it in place. But frankly, the pressures that we're facing at the moment simply don't allow that. We have to act now to reduce our costs in the second half of this year. Else we will be in an even worse situation than we've got. Now, I think it is manageable. I think we can turn this round in year, and I think we can have a budget that's sustainable for the future. But we can't simply ignore this. This is not something to relax about. It's something that has to be tackled urgently on lots of different fronts immediately. I can't emphasise enough just how difficult and serious this situation is.
Sorry, so you're basically agreeing that there's at least a high likelihood of a significant degradation in service as a result of this?
No, that's not what I said. I said we are going to risk assess the applications for voluntary severance. We're not automatically going to accept all of the applications that come along. Where there are areas where there is significant risk to business continuity, they won't be accepted. But we will also try and be flexible in the way in which we allocate the human resources that we have available to ensure that we can, at the same time, maximise the savings we're making while still keeping services going. And that will be done by the department leadership teams on the basis of the applications for voluntary severance that they're getting.
Jude, then Gill, then Tom, and then possibly Gary.
On the first, I suppose it may be just a little naive question, but on one level, in the Green Group office, when I asked our political assistant, can we buy something, can we do something, she says, well, yes, we probably can, but I don't have the authority to authorise that payment. So at a kind of basic level, the grassroots, it seems that there's quite a tight rein on spending, It seems to me, I just don't quite get, I think I'm echoing my colleague here, quite how we can have spent such a lot of money, in a way, without noticing. So I'm just going to put that out there. I'd like somebody at some point in the next few months or years possibly to explain how that happened. It seems to me that's the sort of question that people will ask me in the ward, why has this happened? But on a kind of perhaps more optimistic note, I'd like to ask Anna, the change programme, which I see, that there's a big problem with it. It doesn't seem to have delivered at all as much as we would have liked. But obviously in change programmes there is a certain amount of lag. There is a certain amount of how long it takes for things to impact. Are we optimistic in some way that some of those change savings are still going to appear? Do you understand what I'm asking? And in a way, could you perhaps reassure us that they may come through?
Yeah, so one of the key reviews we're doing is looking at what the original assumptions were around the change programme and where we are actually having the position where the service saying at the moment that hasn't been delivered, we are going back and saying, well, when will you be able to deliver it and what else do we need to be able to do to facilitate that? So there is going to be a review of exactly what can still be delivered, even if it may be at a later stage.
And does that link into stuff that we've already kind of touched on? So certainly with like IT change, there is often an idea that you'll bring in certain new IT practices and then certain positions will be made redundant. So in IT, it's one of the things that can particularly happen. And I'm not sure that I get a feeling that that's being tracked particularly well, or that we know that those... It's to do with the redundancies, isn't it? Again, when you ask for voluntary redundancies, people will offer themselves, as it were, but we must have, presumably within change, certain identified positions or short-term contracts that we know we're going to, stop and finish. So on what level is that being addressed by the kind of redundancy procedure, or looking at where the gaps are? And kind of, I suppose I'm asking, whose job is it to identify that? Is it yours?
Well, it's not mine as an individual, but as a corporate team, we are looking at that. So all service directors are looking at their current positions. So change programme is something that is currently being looked after by a new area. And basically, the service director there is doing a new review about what resources are there. But we wouldn't let somebody who's due to go on a fixed-term contract at the end of the March go on a VS process. So we're managing those contracts, and we're letting people go at the earliest opportunity if they are on a short-term contract.
It wasn't so much that, it was more that if we know that it was to do with kind of material changes to the way that we're operating systems, or efficiencies that we're making. So I suppose it does all feel, I'm going to echo what Charlie said, in a way, the kind of urgency of demanding these voluntary redundancies, and perhaps not spending more time to look at where they're placed and how that impacts on people, as suggested, does kind of ring alarm bells about later on finding out that we have caused ourselves more damage than we thought. I mean, it goes. My original question was going to be about the museum service. So, shutting the museums on a Monday may seem like it saves money, but colleagues of mine within that service say they would very much like to be open to offer a school service and to become more revenue, get more revenue. So, it is that thing, isn't it, about the balance of how we allocate our resources. Okay, thanks.
Right, I'm going to take Tom first because Tom hasn't contributed yet to this round, and then I'll come back to you, Gill, and I will come back to others who want a second bite, but I'm going to ask you, if you get a second bite, to be even quicker and more succinct than the first time round. Tom.
My one will only be quick. So I've also on the change programme. It just seems that it's the largest overspend item, but it seems to have the least amount of detail compared to the other sections of the report. Just wondered, obviously I don't expect to have it here now, but whether we could have a more in-depth look at what specific items haven't been realised and why, and to just see more detail, really.
Gill.
I'll try and be as quick as I can. I just wanted to come back to Nicola's point about social value when we're commissioning and outsourcing. It was just, we have actually referred that issue to Audit Committee, so I think Olly's committee has been starting to sort of think about that and how those criteria can be written in. My other question is about income generating. How good are we as a council at generating our own income? And how ambitious do we want to be with that? Because I know some councils around the country are quite imaginative about providing services that their citizens might pay for in all sorts of aspects, like care and training and various things like that. So what do we do now, and how ambitious are we in that respect?
So I acknowledged earlier that the social value point is really important, and I think actually it's not just in contracts. I think in a whole range of different ways we need to have an engagement with our communities to build some resilience around additional support for vulnerable people, which will help remove some of the pressures from ourselves and in other ways as well. Those are not short-term things. They'll take a while to have an impact, but I do think that's really important, part of what we might need to do in the medium term. In terms of income, Council is pretty good, actually. It's got some innovative ways of generating income which other councils haven't done or haven't got. That doesn't mean to say there aren't other things that we could do. And part of what we will be doing, both in the short term, as is indicated in the report, and in the planning for the future, is thinking about exactly what those opportunities are and how we might maximise them. Always cognizant of the fact that if we have to spend £2 to generate £1 of income, we're making things worse rather than better. So you have to think about the cost associated with being in a more traded situation. But absolutely, and open to suggestions as well. I mean, there are some obvious things to make better use of, like conferencing facilities. We've got some really great assets, but we're not necessarily making the best use of them. There are opportunities, I think, for investment in property, which will generate income, and we've got the capacity to be able to do that. I think the kind of money that we're making from the generation of electricity is also something we could do more of. So I think there are plenty of opportunities. I don't think income generation is going to answer all our questions, all our problems, but it certainly will make a contribution.
Gary, I think you were the last. Did anybody else catch my eye for a second bite? So I know you'll be very quick, Gary.
I mean, I think most of us accept that the previous administration used the big carpet method of budgeting rather too much. And there are major problems, and a lot of this would have been better if dealt with over a period of time rather than in a rush. What really concerns me is, having got the answer to the question of the large amount of money with regard to property, it's clear that that hasn't been got to the bottom of in terms of where we are, and therefore if we don't know our position on that, how can we know that we're making the right decision with regard to the level of staff losses we've got to go for and doing it so quickly? Clearly staff are going to have to go, but if we're doing it in this much of a rush because it hasn't been done previously and we don't have the answers on some of the rest of the stuff, are we going to get it wrong?
Just if I can reprise the property piece again, just to explain why I think we are where we are. At the beginning of the programme, when we were setting up the change programme, some generalised estimates were made of how much might be saved by rationalisation and change in our use of property, but they weren't allocated to individual items. What we have achieved is related to particular properties. So we know that we save money in certain places, and that's what's been achieved. So the gap is between an estimate of what we thought we were going to achieve, which was put in the budget, and what we have achieved. So while I can't tell you what the shortfall relates to, I can tell you what savings we have made.
Oh, yes,
yeah.
I agree. So that in sections 2 and 3 of the answer, you couldn't tell me what the progress is going to be into the future on these.
That's why it's got to be reviewed. Now, when we come to the generalised position around staffing numbers, we know that in general terms we cannot either now or in the future manage our resources while maintaining the total number of staff. We know there's going to have to be a reduction in staff. The process that we're going through at the moment is saying, okay, who would like to go on a voluntary basis? And then we're assessing those applications against the risks associated with who might go and who might not go. So it's not that we're just randomly choosing. So there is a relationship back to service planning. It's just being done in a different way, perhaps not the best way. I would agree that it would be better to do it differently, but it's not. I wouldn't want anyone to go away thinking this is simply random and we're just moving people out of the organisation willy-nilly without any regard to the consequences. That's not the intention. It's based on the knowledge that we know that we need to reduce the workforce, but we're doing it and allowing it to happen in a way which is risk assessed.
Right. I'm going to bring this item to a conclusion and thank everybody for their contribution. I am, however, going to use my prerogative to just say that not everybody agrees with Gary's comments about the previous administration's budgeting process. I'm not going to go into a defence of it now, but Gary's repeated attempts to make slurs on public webcasts so that he can then quote them back later as being fact are not acceptable to me, even if they're acceptable to others. Thank you for what, apart from that one contribution from Gary, was a really constructive debate. And clearly, Stephen and Annabelle, thank you for the openness and the way you've approached this. And I hope that we can carry on a constructive dialogue in the difficult challenges that you've got ahead in the next couple of months. Item 11 on the agenda is audit referral, public engagement at meetings, which you have, and I have is page 116 of our papers. I think the overwhelming size of the public gallery this evening is perhaps indicative of the challenge that we have, and I have a feeling we're probably not overwhelmed with people watching us on the webcast either. So I think it's a very timely point, Olly, for us all to bear in mind. It would be very easy tomorrow for us to select items for our work programme that we all feel passionately about and feel are going to make a vast difference to the city, but we perhaps also need to be thinking about whether it's really of interest to the people we represent. And whilst we shouldn't be doing it solely for that reason, I think we do need to question how scrutiny makes itself effective, and I think that also relates to the fact that we possibly do that by identifying real issues rather than choosing to just do pre-decision scrutiny of a large number of items because it makes us feel we've done a lot. So I am hoping that if members share that view, we will be able to influence other colleagues at the meeting tomorrow. Olly, do you want to speak very briefly to this?
Very briefly, Chair. I'd like to actually thank Nicola Bowden-Jones, one of the new councillors, for pointing and raising this at Audit at one of our earlier meetings, proving again that how great it is that when you get fresh blood and fresh eyes in the council, people do bring up things. And part of me is concerned about the difficulty of engagement, and I'm guessing that at the minute there are probably 5 people at home wondering why the iPlayer version of Bake Off is not as exciting as usual. But on the other hand, I went to a really fascinating International Women's Day event at the M Shed a couple of years ago, and the new ambassador from Nicaragua was there, and there was a talk about how engagement and how getting women involved in the political process and other things had massively improved in Nicaragua. In fact, they're now number 6 in the world for gender equality. So they're just behind the Nordic nations and well ahead of countries like the UK. But the big challenge they faced was that although on the one hand they'd managed to open out government, they'd managed to try and generate more interest in politics among the people, most people still wanted to watch their soap operas or the football or go to a bar for a drink and let the politicians get on with actually sorting stuff out. And really what they seemed to want in Nicaragua was the strong leadership, whoever it was, that would actually get on with the job of fixing stuff up and sorting things out. That said, we are trying to keep people engaged. We are a democratic country, but you can't force people to come to a meeting or to watch it on a on a webcast at home. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do know that on stuff where we're supposedly trying to engage more, especially in my case a neighbourhood partnership that doesn't always have huge attendance, I think it's an issue that does need to be looked at nonetheless. And certainly I think also one thing we could improve is how when people have identified a concern that they have that does generate a lot of interest, how they can best go about turning that energy and that frustration probably into some kind of positive, productive action. Again, it might not necessarily involve them all having to go to meetings, but there's got to be some kind of better system, and maybe one that doesn't involve having the occasional tank on College Green.
There is a constitutional working group which is starting to look at some of these issues. I think that we do, and Sid touched on this briefly, I think we've got a real problem, though, that we, as members, we welcome public forum at council meetings as long as it's only half an hour. And actually, if you see the anger on the faces of the people who've turned up to make a point, but were too busy talking about really weighty things to listen to their issue, we have to really reconsider what our aims are. And we had a delegation from Johannesburg some years ago, and it was where they still very much cherish their democracy because it's a new experience to them. And they actually have a petitions and statements committee that is the sole purpose of listening to the concerns of people and then referring those on for action. And I think that's where perhaps we who think we're the home of democracy and therefore don't need to learn, actually need to examine how do we make it, because to me, if we have 200 people wanting to turn up for public forum, that's a really positive sign that they're interested. But in fact, all we do is allow 5 of them to say something and then we go on to next business. So I think there are serious issues there. What I'm not sure is how we progress this, because the Constitution Working Group is meeting over the next 3 or 4 months. And I think it would be useful if Scrutiny could have a contribution into that process, because even if cabinet meetings and processes have to fit a certain process, there is no reason why we can't take on some of the points that Sid was making and talk about how can we make our processes more user-friendly for engagement. Jude.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we saw last night a really excellent demonstration of how that can be done. So the big conversation about housing, which was co-organised with Acorn, advertised on Eventbrite as an open invitation and including voluntary groups, was oversubscribed, and the event was incredibly successful in getting people into a room and talking about something that they're very concerned about. And I'm sure if we were to open up parts of Scrutiny to a similar sort of process, people would love to come and talk about buses and transport and money and stuff like that. And in some ways, having it in the Cash Hall I thought was an excellent venue. It's not such an imposing space as this one, and it does not necessarily have to be that the public forum is physically and directly linked to the meeting to which it addresses. You know, I can imagine a place where something that's of importance to place Scrutiny could be discussed in a forum like yesterday, and then the findings and the listening of the kind of people who need to listen, I include myself in that, are then spoken about at the next place meeting. So I really, really hope that we can work towards doing that sort of thing, and it would engage people more. It is really, really important. I mean, this is, in truth, a very sad position to be in, isn't it, where we're discussing incredibly important budget issues, incredibly important audit stuff. All of us have given up our time, and we want to get the people to understand how these things are happening, and the gallery is empty apart from the dedicated one. And I don't know, and you, thank you very much, but he's press now, you see. Well, he's live blogging for all we know. No, joking. But do we know how many people watch this on the webcast? I know that we have Green Group people that watch it and back and do stuff. But do we have figures on it? So yeah, can we open up all these different ways of doing stuff and and how quickly can we do it? I suppose I've got a question about that, which is to do with budget. Maybe, it costs more to have an event in the cash hall and to provide service staff, but I'm sure we can do it. Thanks.
Gary?
Well, people will get involved in whichever process if the subject is interesting to them, it matters to them, and that they think it can make a difference. The problem is, why would anyone think that sitting in here make a difference? They really can't see the relevance.
Why are we all here then?
Well, why are we here?
Yeah. But to the general public, why would they think that coming along here would make a significant difference? They do turn up to full council because they think that's the decision-making body, and it's the big stage, and that's good that they come there. Although there's been efforts to squash them, unfortunately, and reduce their ability to speak. And part of the problem that we have with this scrutiny process is that we don't go where the action is, and we don't actually react when there are real issues which are building up. So a committee that's looking at transport as that within its responsibilities ought to be going where there's a big transport issue and speaking to local people, that sort of thing. And I don't see any reason why scrutiny commissions can't actually do that. And I realise that we obviously have to go through the formal process of looking at the forward plan and following that through. But if we don't have enough flexibility within our processes to go where the action is and go to where people think there's an important issue, we are always going to have a problem.
Brenda and then Tom.
Thank you. I expect you remember, Chair, when we started moving cabinet meetings around the city, we had lots of complaints from people that wherever we were was in the wrong place for those people who were interested. And we ended up usually with the local ward councillors being there and absolutely nobody else because they were so difficult for anybody to find. So I don't think it's any of it's to do with the venue in the same way, though I do understand what you're saying, Jude. I think the cash hall was actually a very good event last night, and there were lots of people there. But I think perhaps some of it is also to do with the content. At people scrutiny, for instance, we frequently do get quite a lot of participation because people know what we're talking about and it's something that's quite relevant to them. Whereas I'm not sure that what we've been looking at tonight, if you look at that as a member of the public, the headlines on there, although we know it's really important, it's not necessarily something that somebody thinks, well, actually, I want to go out and have a look at this and understand what people are talking about. So I do think we need to look into it a lot more deeply and understand why people are not particularly interested in coming and sitting in a lovely hall next to Craig and Sid and, listening to us talking about budgets. It's perhaps the content as much as anything else that is a problem.
Tom.
Yeah, I support what Geoff and Jude and other people have been saying. My point on the webcast, I tried to watch the cabinet on my phone earlier in the week and it doesn't work on Android, so there's improvements that can be made in the IT there. But that's just a side point. The main thing I was going to say is that, yeah, we should be improving public engagement in the meetings, but I think it should go wider. And as we saw last meeting of this committee, in the consultation on devolution, that was lower than maybe members would have expected. And on local consultations as well, there's a traffic regulation order consultation going on in my ward at the moment that people don't really know about, haven't really heard about. So I think we should look at across the board how the council communicates with and engages with the public. Meetings is of course a huge part of that, but I think it should go wider really.
Charlie?
So I was going to, yes, Sid's statement, first point, line 2, I have a high tolerance for reading hundreds of pages of turgid policy documents. Well, that sort of sums it all up for me. If we could do something which is more readable, that would at least help. And I might add that, couldn't we do council meetings in the style of just a minute?
Jude, were you wanting to come back?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, it is a matter of kind of will, isn't it? And, you know, in terms of this meeting, for example, we have a report that is very detailed on internationalism. But I suspect that there was no direct invitation to the twinning organisations, to international students, to, you know, all those people who may well have been very interested in listening to that report or contributing from the public gallery. And you do have to directly invite people, particularly when you know that they've got interest. So Acorn last night, the housing meeting, it was because there was a very specific and direct invitation to a very specific set of people. And of course we have a very mixed agenda, but it could be possible, you know, it would have been possible presumably to say to certain groups, this is coming up on the agenda, you are warmly invited, and you only need to come to that 20-minute section, but we would really like you to be there. And I think you'd be surprised that when you issue that sort of invitation to people, they will respond. And perhaps that's something to do with it. I'm going to call it social marketing because that's effectively what it is. How the organisation socially markets its events and the stuff that it does. It is something that we're not very good at, actually, across the board.
I think we are. I think we're all in agreement, and I think we could go on with this discussion for the rest of the evening and not actually progress it. What I'm going to suggest is that could members and indeed Sid and anybody else who is watching on the webcast or the replay, please let Lucy have thoughts and suggestions. And because we don't have a meeting for some time, if with Lucy we can pull that together into a report which we can circulate to all members and anyone else who's made a contribution so that we can actually start the process of what we can do. And just a reminder to any scrutiny commission that you don't have to meet here. So this is about trying different options, but Brenda's absolutely right that when we were meeting at the Vassal Centre and there was virtually nobody there, and then someone turned up and it would take them 2.5 hours to get into the centre and get the bus out again, we very much had to reconsider and persuade the then mayor to reconsider the idea of going around to people, because it was actually far from being inclusive, it was being exclusive. So we've got to make sure we do get that balance. But please, if you can put your thoughts in, and we will then try and put a draft together, we'll circulate by email for some modification and development. Brenda.
Just a very quick one. Why can't we've got the council's got a Facebook page, haven't they? Or an address or Twitter, because I've seen some of it. Why can't we put on there, you know, come along tonight, there's a fantastic meeting, we're going to be talking about budgets. I'm only joking. But, you know, that sort of thing. You know, if people understand that something that we're talking about is really important to them, if they don't know, and I can't imagine that many people out there are going to sit and search the online Bristol City Council page to go, oh, look, we can go along to Scrutiny tonight. Whereas if you put something on there, say, actually we're talking about something that's going to impact on you, about whether you are going to have enough houses, noticing Paul's just come in, or whether you know, something about payments, budgets for social care, that type of thing, that's when you're going to get a bit more interest. But if people don't know about it, they're not going to want to come anyway.
Absolutely right. Andrea.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to highlight to members that on the list of suggested topics to be discussed tomorrow at the Scrutiny Work Programme setting, this is actually on there about 3 times from different areas. So obviously tomorrow when you're setting your work programme, you may want to make this one of the priority areas, for example, for not necessarily a report, but it could be a select committee or a working group and some in-depth work on this. I've also had an indication it's also one of the topics that the Mayor is particularly keen to engage scrutiny on as well. So I would just sort of urge, if everyone is strongly sort of supportive of this, that obviously there is a chance tomorrow to obviously ensure that it is an item that's looked at in depth as part of scrutiny going forward.
Right. Thank you. So we move on next, item 12, the referral from the Mayor on the elimination of the gender and race pay gap. The Mayor in his first council meeting talked about referring this matter to scrutiny. This report outlines the fact that there are a number of other committees that are already dealing with the issue, and it seemed inappropriate for us to get involved in detail, but also recognising that it is one of those things that might end up with so many people involved with it that nothing happens. So the proposal is that we have a watching brief to have feedback in from the HR committee rather than actually adding this to our work programme. But I wanted to bring that to this meeting, not least that we could get agreement, but also so that we were able to respond to the Mayor to say this is all the strands that are going on and how it's being dealt with. Are members happy with that approach? Right, thank you. So the next item is the Mayor's response to our statement on budget timetable and forward plan, which you've all had a response to. We haven't got the forward plan that I was hoping for, but certainly Stephen has quite rightly pointed out to me that there are certain things that are beyond reason in the circumstances that the authority is finding itself at the moment. Marvin is very committed to establishing the forward plan, but recognises that it has to happen over a time frame that is workable. And I think the answer sets out how we are going to move forward for now, but Marvin is very keen to develop the forward plan in a way that will work for both executive and scrutiny. I think we need to keep watching for any significant variations where we are not getting sufficient notice. But I also want to convey that there's a dual approach here, because I want the forward plan to have information so that decisions are capable of being scrutinised. But I want, for the most part, us to choose not to make pre-decision scrutiny unless we think it is something of such importance that we can make a key contribution to the process. And I refer it back to the last item, that in a sense, unless we can ensure that it's relevant to members of the public, simply doing it because any one of us thinks there's a political expediency to doing it probably isn't much appreciated by those that we're representing. So it's that getting that balance right. Does anybody have anything they want to comment on briefly on this issue? No? Okay. So then we go on to the Scrutiny Shadow Work Programme. And I think we are just noting that. Lucy, there's nothing else, because effectively that finishes hopefully tomorrow.
It finishes tomorrow, yes, Chair, and it'll be replaced with a new one for the rest of the year.
Right. Everybody happy to note that? Excellent. So then we move on to the forward plan, which is, we decided that we would have this on a regular basis. Now, this is the August forward plan, which is presumably being replaced by the next edition, which has come out or is about to come out.
The next edition has recently come out, but at the time of publication, that was the one that was available. So I guess in future we could circulate an addendum so that you've got the most up-to-date one for your meeting, and we'll take that back. That's a fair point.
So this was really to form a basis for tomorrow's meeting. But again, I think if we look at where scrutiny has been most constructive, it's actually been on targeted items rather than forward plan items. So it's making sure that we get that balance right. Does anyone have anything they wish to raise on the forward plan? No? Okay. So then we go on to the protocol for dealing with exempt items. which I'm just trying to find a moment. Now, this was raised substantially as a result of the scrutiny involvement in the waste contract, and this is an ongoing piece of work. So really what you've got here is simply showing where we are. I have raised the point that I think there's a danger that exempt items can be used as a way of reducing the need to produce a concise, informative report that can go into the public domain, and a short amount of exempt paperwork if necessary. My own view is that some of the stuff that's exempt, actually we probably don't even need to know, and that therefore that is an issue for officers to assess before the information comes to us. But I'm keen that we establish a protocol, because ultimately it cannot be us in scrutiny who make the decision whether something is exempt. It has to be the legal department and senior officers who determine whether the information can be shared in the public domain. But I'm keen that we develop a more effective process that doesn't see a belt embraces very large exempt report, because I don't think that is appropriate. And personally, I find it very confusing, because I can't remember in the public session that precedes it whether I'm discussing an item that's exempt or not, because I can't remember where I read it. So I'm really keen that we develop ways of making that work. So this is very much work in progress. Nancy, did you want to add?
No, nothing to add, Chair, but happy to take any questions.
Stephen?
Yeah, just to agree with you that the objective should be to seek to put into the public domain as much information as possible. That's the nature of how local government should work. And this report is saying we're going to review that, have a look at how we've come to those decisions in the past and see what we can do about changing it. There is also a legal process about actually what the legal process is, and we're taking detailed advice about that as well. But the thrust of it is what can we do to put more information in the public domain. So on that basis, we're agreed with your need to try and do that.
But to also add the other aspect, that I would not want to happen is us to be trying to force something into the public domain that might jeopardise the authority, and that's something where we have to make sure that balance is right. Olly.
Just a quick observation, Chair, which is unusual for me, but it was that the drawback with having quite a bit of exempt information is that the conspiracy theorists can come to the conclusion that what was exempted was interesting. I have read exempt documents before as a councillor. They have been probably the driest documents I've read and among the least interesting. But there was a good reason why they were exempt at that point in time. It was to do with the setting up of the new waste and electricity companies and how that would all be organised for commercial sensitivity or whatever. It was kept under wraps. I have to say I was bitterly disappointed at getting access to them and thinking, because I thought, well, it might be quite interesting to read an exempt document, but it clearly wasn't. But the drawback is that when any organisation, but particularly run by politicians, has exempt stuff, people leap to the conclusion that what is exempted must have been exciting or interesting, when for the most part I don't believe it is.
Talk of conspiracy theorists, Gary.
In actual fact, I mean, you referred to the waste thing. I didn't actually find any problem with that at all. The way that was handled, I thought, was fine. There was a very serious problem with the way that arena reports were given previously, and that was a great concern. What I'm not seeing here, really, is Because obviously the legal officers have to make the final decision. But I'm not seeing what we need to have, which is the right people able to challenge that decision to see whether it is robust and whether the reasons are robust. And, you know, I've seen examples where there was a leak from the Cabinet on a matter actually to do with Metrobus. And, you know, there was a lot of hoo-ha about that. But in actual fact, one of the reasons why it was leaked was because even the ward councillors who were massively affected were not even informed as to what was actually going on. And, you know, if that sort of thing actually happens, it's an encouragement to leak, and it means that sometimes stuff gets out that shouldn't actually get out. So it's the process of the decision-making, but the right people to be able to challenge that decision.
Gary, this is one of those unusual occasions where you made a persuasive case. That may be. I think that is. I do think that's a valid point, and I think if we can take that on board, because any process has to have the ability for a genuine and valid challenge to be raised and a means of resolving it. So I think we do need to make sure that is accounted for. Otherwise, there would be the ability for things to be appear to be concealed, which is clearly what we want to avoid that challenge. So, thank you, Gary. Does anybody else have any other point? Right, so the final item is the date of next meeting, which slightly strangely... I might hurry to get to the end. Scrutiny resolution and full council motion tracker. Lucy?
This is just your standing item, members. It's there for information purposes, really, just to remind you of what's been agreed at all the meetings and the progress since you've had those discussions. So happy to take any questions, but it's there primarily for information.
Any questions? No? Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the difficulty putting too much detail in here, but half a dozen items within progress really doesn't tell us too much on some of them.
Right, so next meeting, our next formal meeting preceded by a Mayor's question time is the 9th of February. Our next extraordinary meeting is currently scheduled for the 3rd of November. At the time we were scheduling to discuss the business plans for the trading companies, it is possible that may not be available by those meetings. I think, following discussions that came up yesterday, it is possible that won't be the case. But on the other hand, that was also fixed before we had the responsibility for the budget process, which I think may require us to meet before the 3rd of November, or will certainly give us a purpose for a number of meetings after that date. So at the moment, the 3rd of November and the 9th of February are the next scheduled meeting dates, but there will be additions to that. Can I bring this meeting to a close and thank everybody for their, well, not everybody in the public gallery, but every member of the Commission for their patience and for staying until the end. So I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.